On the evening of April 22nd, 1993, Stephen Lawrence left his uncle's house in southeast London with the kind of small, ordinary expectations that rarely make it into history. He was 18, a sixth form student with ambitions to become an architect, carrying exam stress and teenage restlessness rather than fear. The plan was simple: catch a bus home from Wellhall Road in Eltham with his close friend, Duane Brooks. It was just after 10:30 p.m. The streetlights were on. Traffic passed intermittently. Nothing about the night suggested that it would become one of the most scrutinized crime scenes in modern British history. As they waited at the bus stop, Stephen and Duane talked casually, the way friends do when time needs filling. A group of white youths loitered nearby. They were not strangers to the area, nor were they unknown to local police. Their presence, however, registered only as background noise in a neighborhood accustomed to tension, but not prepared for what came next. Without warning, the group crossed a road and rushed the two teenagers. What followed lasted no more than a few seconds. Racial slurs were shouted. Stephen was stabbed twice, once in the shoulder, once in the chest. The blade pierced a lung and severed a major artery. The attackers ran back across the road and disappeared into the night as quickly as they had emerged. Stephen did not die immediately. He staggered forward, running approximately 130 meters before collapsing. Duane ran beside him, screaming for help, flagging down passing cars. Stephen bled heavily on the pavement. The violence had been brief, but its consequences were irreversible. By the time an ambulance arrived and Stephen was taken to hospital, he had lost too much blood. He was pronounced dead shortly after arrival. From the very first moments after the attack, there were signs that this was not an ordinary murder. It bore the hallmarks of a racist attack: random, targeted, brutal. Duane Brooks gave a description of the attackers. Local residents named suspects almost immediately. Within hours, names were circulating in the neighborhood, whispered with a kind of certainty that comes not from speculation, but from familiarity. The killers, many believed, were not hiding. They were known. Yet urgency was absent where it mattered most. The initial police response was slow and disorganized. Officers did not immediately seal off the crime scene. Potential forensic evidence was left exposed. Witnesses were not properly separated or interviewed. Duane Brooks, a traumatized teenager who had just watched his friend die, was treated less like a victim and more like an inconvenience. No family liaison officer was assigned to Stephen's parents in the crucial early days. Neville and Doreen Lawrence were left to absorb the news of their son's death with little guidance, little information, and no sense that the system was moving swiftly on their behalf. In the days that followed, police attention drifted. Although several suspects were identified early on, arrests were delayed. Surveillance was poorly executed. Basic investigative steps searching homes promptly, securing clothing for forensic testing were missed or conducted too late. When suspects were finally questioned, crucial time had been lost. Alibis had hardened. Evidence had vanished. The opportunity to strike, while fear and uncertainty might have loosened tongues, was gone. What deepened the family's pain was not only the loss of Stephen, but the growing sense that his death did not command the seriousness it deserved. Doreen Lawrence would later recall waiting by the phone for updates that never came. Press conferences were sparse. Communication was minimal. It felt to the family as though their son's life was being quietly filed away, another statistic in a system accustomed to moving on. Meanwhile, the suspects continued their lives with alarming normality. Some were overheard boasting. Others made no effort to hide their hostility. Rumors circulated of confessions made casually in public spaces. Yet these accounts did not translate into decisive police action. The gap between what the community seemed to know and what the police appeared willing to pursue widened into a chasm. As weeks turned into months, the case stalled. The Crown Prosecution Service concluded that there was insufficient evidence to bring charges. The decision was devastating. For the Lawrence family, it was not merely a legal setback, but a moral one. It suggested that the burden of proof required to defend their son's memory was higher than that demanded in other cases. The message, implicit but unmistakable, was that Stephen's life did not carry the same weight. In response, the family did something rare and risky. They refused to accept the closure offered to them. With the support of their lawyers, they initiated a private prosecution against 5 suspects, an extraordinary step that placed enormous emotional and financial strain on them. The courtroom became another site of trauma. The defendant sat meters away, unmoved. The case collapsed when key evidence was ruled inadmissible. evidence that might have been preserved had the original investigation been competent. The defendants walked free. Under double jeopardy laws then in force, they could not be tried again. Outside the courtroom, the Lawrence family faced not only grief but scrutiny. They were portrayed at times as difficult, demanding, unwilling to let go. What was often missed was the simple truth that letting go had never been an option. Stephen's death had left too many unanswered questions, too many visible failures. Silence, in this context, would have been another form of injustice. The early years of the Stephen Lawrence case are defined less by what happened than by what did not. Justice did not move quickly. Authority did not act decisively. Compassion did not come naturally. Instead, there was delayed defensiveness and a quiet closing of ranks. These omissions mattered as much as any action, because they shaped everything that followed. They allowed a racially motivated killing to become, initially, an unsolved crime not for lack of clues, but for lack of will. By the mid-1990s, Stephen Lawrence was no longer just a victim of a street attack. He had become a symbol, though not yet by design, of a deeper sickness within the criminal justice system. His parents, still grieving, were being forced into roles they never sought: campaigners, spokespeople, reluctant experts in police procedure. The road ahead would be long, public, and painful. But in these first months, before inquiries and reforms, before headlines and apologies, there was only a dead teenager, a shattered family, and a question that refused to fade: how could so much go wrong so quickly and remain uncorrected? By the time the initial shock of Stephen Lawrence's death began to settle into grief, the Metropolitan Police investigation had already drifted off course. What followed was not a single catastrophic error, but a succession of smaller decisions, hesitations, omissions, misjudgments that accumulated into failure. Each misstep narrowed the path to justice, until the path itself seemed to disappear. Within days of the murder, the names of several suspects were circulating openly in Eltham. They were known locally, associated with racist behavior and violence, and, crucially, they were named to police by members of the public. Duane Brooks also provided descriptions consistent with these individuals. Yet arrests were not made immediately. Instead of acting swiftly while memories were fresh and fear might prompt cooperation, police delayed. Homes were not searched promptly. Clothing that might have carried blood or fibers was not seized in time. When searches eventually occurred, they yielded little by then. Any incriminating evidence could easily have been destroyed. The handling of witnesses compounded the damage. Duane Brooks, the key eyewitness, was treated with suspicion rather than care. He was not given proper support, despite being traumatized and injured. His account was questioned aggressively, as though inconsistency were proof of dishonesty rather than a symptom of shock. Other potential witnesses were not systematically identified or followed up. Some reported feeling dismissed. Others were never contacted again. The sense that police were not truly interested in building a case took hold in the community. Surveillance, when it was attempted, was poorly planned. Suspects were observed sporadically, without clear objectives or coordination. Opportunities to gather intelligence were missed. Informants were not cultivated. At times, it appeared that police assumed the case would not progress and acted accordingly, treating it as already lost rather than urgently salvageable. This quiet fatalism became self-fulfilling. Internally, the investigation suffered from a lack of leadership and direction. Responsibilities shifted between officers. Lines of accountability blurred. Decisions were made without documentation or later explanation. When questions were raised by the family, by lawyers, by journalists, answers were vague or defensive. There was little evidence of reflection or urgency, no visible effort to correct course once mistakes became apparent. The most damaging consequence of this dysfunction emerged in the legal arena. When the Crown Prosecution Service reviewed the case, it concluded that the evidence gathered by police was insufficient to meet the threshold for prosecution. This was not because evidence never existed, but because it had not been preserved, developed, or presented effectively. The investigation had failed at the most basic level, transforming credible suspicion into admissible proof. For the Lawrence family, this decision confirmed their worst fears. They had watched, from the sidelines, as police activity dwindled and communication faltered. Now, the system was telling them that nothing more could be done. The implication was stark. The opportunity for justice had passed, not because the truth was unknowable, but because it had been mishandled. The family's response to pursue a private prosecution exposed further weaknesses. During these proceedings, it became clear how fragile the case had become. Key forensic opportunities had been lost. Witness testimony was undermined by the passage of time and earlier police failures. When the judge ruled crucial evidence inadmissible, the case collapsed. The defendants were acquitted under the double jeopardy rule. They could not be tried again. What had begun as investigative inertia ended as permanent legal closure. As public scrutiny intensified, the Metropolitan Police closed ranks. Criticism was met with defensiveness rather than transparency. Senior officers rejected suggestions of bias or incompetence. The family's concerns were framed as misunderstandings. Yet internally, doubts were growing. Reviews of the investigation began to surface uncomfortable truths, failures in leadership, failures in procedure, failures in judgment that could not be easily explained away. The accusation that would later dominate discussion institutional racism was not initially voiced in official language, but it hovered over every decision that seemed to downplay the murder of a black teenager. Why were obvious suspects not arrested sooner? Why was the key witness treated as a problem rather than priority? Why did the investigation lack the urgency seen in other cases? These questions did not require proof of overt prejudice. They pointed instead to assumptions, blind spots, and indifference embedded in routine practice. Media involvement shifted the balance. Investigative journalists began examining the case, laying out timelines, highlighting contradictions, and amplifying a family's voice. The disparity between police statements and documented actions became harder to ignore. Public confidence began to erode. The case was no longer a local tragedy. It was becoming a national embarrassment. For the officers involved, the instinct to protect the institution often outweighed the obligation to confront uncomfortable truths. Apologies were rare. Admissions of error were carefully worded. Each acknowledgement seemed to come only after pressure, never before. This resistance deepened the family's sense that the system was more concerned with its own reputation than with accountability for Stephen's death. By the late 1990s, the Stephen Lawrence investigation stood as a case study in how not to police a murder. It demonstrated how delay corrodes evidence, how dismissing witnesses silences truth, and how a lack of self-examination can transform tragedy into scandal. The original crime had lasted minutes. The investigative failures stretched on for years. What made this phase especially painful was the knowledge that it did not have to be this way. The suspects had not vanished. The community had not been silent. The clues had not been obscure. Justice had been within reach and then allowed to slip away. Each missed chance carried a human cost, borne most heavily by a family forced to watch the system fail their son in slow motion. This was the point at which the case crossed a threshold. It was no longer only about solving a murder. It was about understanding why the machinery of justice had stalled and whether it was capable of confronting its own reflection. By the time the criminal justice system had exhausted its official explanations, Stephen Lawrence's parents had reached a different conclusion. If the truth was ever going to be acknowledged, it would not come from patience or quiet trust. It would have to be forced into the open. What began as private grief hardened into public resolve, not out of choice but necessity. Neville and Doreen Lawrence were not activists by background. They were ordinary working-class parents who had lost their eldest son in a senseless act of violence. In the years following Stephen's death, they found themselves navigating police reviews, courtrooms, and media scrutiny, learning a new language of legal thresholds and procedural excuses. Every step forward seemed to be met with an institutional shrug. Their persistence was often mischaracterized as stubbornness. In reality, it was survival. The family's decision to speak openly changed the trajectory of the case. They gave interviews not to provoke sympathy, but to document inconsistency. They described missed phone calls, contradictory statements, and emotional isolation they felt when official support failed to materialize. These accounts resonated far beyond Eltham. For many black families in Britain, the Lawrence case reflected experiences they already understood too well. Crimes taken less seriously, complaints reframed as inconvenience, and grief compounded by disbelief. The turning point came with the involvement of investigative journalists and civil rights advocates who recognized that the failures in Stephen's case were not random. Detailed reconstructions of the investigation revealed patterns hesitation where urgency was required, skepticism directed disproportionately at black witnesses, and an almost reflexive unwillingness to consider racism as a motivating factor. The narrative shifted from individual error to systemic flaw. Under mounting pressure, the government announced a public inquiry in 1997, chaired by Sir William Macpherson. For the Lawrence family, this was both vindication and risk. Public inquiries promised transparency, but they also exposed families to renewed scrutiny and emotional strain. The hearings reopened wounds, forcing the parents to relive the night of Stephen's murder while listening to official justifications for what followed. The Macpherson Inquiry was unprecedented in its scope and candor. It examined not only the murder and its investigation, but the culture of the Metropolitan Police itself. Witnesses were called, documents were scrutinized. Decisions that had once been buried in bureaucratic routine were dragged into daylight. For the first time, senior officers were compelled to explain their actions in public. The inquiry's findings, published in 1999, marked a watershed moment. It concluded that the investigation into Stephen Lawrence's murder had been marred by professional incompetence, institutional racism, and a failure of leadership. The phrase institutional racism entered the national vocabulary with a force that could not be ignored. It did not accuse every officer of personal prejudice, but it indicted a system whose structures and assumptions consistently produced discriminatory outcomes. For the Lawrence family, the report was a painful affirmation. It validated what they had known intuitively for years, that their son's case had been treated differently, but it could not undo the damage already done. The suspects named in the early days remained free. The double jeopardy rule still stood. Accountability for the original failures was limited, diluted by time and institutional caution. Yet the impact of the inquiry extended far beyond the case itself. Its recommendations reshaped British policing and criminal justice policy. New standards for investigating racist crimes were introduced. Training on race relations became mandatory. The definition of a racist incident was expanded to include the perception of the victim or any other person, rather than the judgment of police alone. These changes acknowledge implicitly that trust had been broken and needed rebuilding. Public reaction was intense. Many welcomed the report as overdue honesty. Others resisted it, seeing the term institutional racism as an unfair stain on policing. The debate was fierce, often uncomfortable, and deeply revealing. It forced the country to confront questions it had long avoided, whose lives were protected most vigorously, and whose complaints were easiest to dismiss. Throughout this period, Neville and Doreen Lawrence remained central, though they never sought to be symbols. Their appearances were marked by restraint rather than rhetoric. They spoke of Stephen not as an emblem, but as a person's son who loved sports, who planned for university, who never came home. This refusal to let the case become abstract was its moral anchor. Still, progress was uneven. Despite the inquiry's conclusions, concrete movement toward prosecution remained elusive. Reviews were conducted, files were revisited, apologies were offered, but justice, in the narrow legal sense, remained stalled. The family had succeeded in changing the system's language and priorities, yet their own case remained unresolved. This paradox defined the third phase of the Stephen Lawrence story. The murder had sparked national reform, but the victim's family still lived with the absence of accountability. The system could admit fault, even promise change, without delivering closure. For the Lawrences, this was a bitter reality. Their fight had improved conditions for others, but not yet for their son. As the years passed, public attention inevitably waned. New scandals emerged. Political priorities shifted, but the Lawrence family did not retreat. They understood that reform without resolution risked becoming symbolic rather than substantive. Their insistence on both systemic change and individual accountability kept the case alive when it might otherwise have faded into history. By the early 2000s, the Stephen Lawrence case had transformed from an unsolved murder into a measure of the nation's willingness to confront itself. The question was no longer whether the system had failed, but whether it was capable of correcting that failure in the only way that truly mattered, by delivering justice, however delayed. The final chapter of the Stephen Lawrence case did not arrive with a sense of triumph. It came slowly, almost reluctantly, shaped by time, technology, and the quiet persistence of unanswered questions. Nearly 2 decades after Stephen was murdered, the possibility of justice reemerged not because the system suddenly found courage, but because science had advanced enough to expose what had long been suspected. For years after the Macpherson report, the official position remained largely unchanged. The suspects named in the early 1990s were still at liberty. Double jeopardy laws, which prevented a person from being tried twice for the same crime, stood as an immovable barrier. Reviews continued, but they produced little more than acknowledgement of past failure. The case seemed destined to remain a symbol rather than a resolution. What shifted the ground was forensic progress. Advances in DNA analysis made it possible to re-examine evidence once considered inconclusive. Clothing seized years earlier items that had survived not because of foresight, but by chance was tested again with more sensitive techniques. In this evidence, traces emerged that had not been detectable before. Fibers, blood, minute biological material began to tell a story the original investigation had failed to capture. At the same time, legal reform caught up with moral pressure. In 2005, the double jeopardy rule in England and Wales was changed, allowing retrials in serious cases where new and compelling evidence came to light. This reform was not designed for Stephen Lawrence alone, but his case was never far from the discussion. It represented exactly the kind of failure the old rule had protected from correction. In 2010, the Crown Prosecution Service announced that two of the original suspects, Gary Dobson and David Norris, would face trial for Stephen's murder. The news landed heavily. For the Lawrence family, it reopened wounds they had learned to live with. For the public, it forced a reckoning with how long justice could be delayed without losing its meaning. The trial itself was marked by restraint rather than spectacle. The evidence was technical, forensic, meticulous. It did not rely on confessions or dramatic revelations, but on what remained microscopic traces linking the defendants to the scene and to Stephen's body. The defense challenged the reliability of evidence preserved over so many years. The prosecution argued that delay did not negate truth. In January 2012, the jury returned guilty verdicts against Dobson and Norris. They were sentenced to life imprisonment, with minimum terms reflecting their age at the time of the crime. The courtroom response was muted, almost subdued. There were no cheers, no sense of closure that matched the scale of what had been lost. Outside, Neville and Doreen Lawrence spoke briefly. They welcomed the verdict, but their words carried restraint rather than relief. Nothing about the outcome could restore their son's life, or erase the years spent waiting. The convictions answered one question but left many others unresolved. 3 other suspects were never tried. The original investigative failures were not undone by the eventual verdicts. Accountability within the police remained limited. Careers had ended quietly, not decisively. The system had corrected itself partially, but without fully confronting the cost of its delay. In the years that followed, the Stephen Lawrence case continued to echo through British public life. His name became permanently linked with debates about race, policing, and trust. Schools, charities, and public institutions invoked his story as a reminder of what happens when systems fail the people they are meant to protect. In 2013, Stephen was posthumously awarded an Obey for services to community relations, a gesture meant to honor his legacy rather than the circumstances of his death. Yet the discomfort never entirely faded. For many, the case remained a measure of injustice endured rather than justice achieved. 2 convictions after 18 years did not balance the scale against a life taken in seconds. Reform arrived, but only after relentless pressure from a family who refused to disappear quietly into grief. What makes the Stephen Lawrence case endure is not simply its outcome, but its chronology. Each phase reveals how delay compounds harm, how institutional defensiveness can outlast evidence, and how truth often survives not because systems are designed to protect it, but because individuals refuse to abandon it. The Lawrence's persistence forced a nation to look at itself, and to accept that progress often begins with admission of failure. Stephen Lawrence left home one evening expecting to return. He never did. The justice system took nearly 20 years to speak his name in a verdict that acknowledged what had been done to him. By then, the damage was irreversible, but the lesson remained. Justice delayed is not neutral. It reshapes lives, erodes trust, and leaves scars that no conviction can fully heal. The story ends without neat resolution. It ends with partial accountability, lasting reform, and an absence that cannot be filled. Stephen Lawrence is remembered not only for how he died, but for what his death revealed and for the uncomfortable truth that justice, when it finally arrives, often does so too late to comfort those who needed it most.